As you may know, 1956 was a year of turmoil and crises. There was the Suez Crisis, for example, in the fall of 1956. And there was this event in November of 1956, the Hungarian Revolution. In 1956, Hungarians, they were fighting for their political freedoms. They wanted freedom of speech, they wanted freedom of assembly, they wanted to rid themselves of Soviet rule, which they had been under for the previous 8 years. It was a time of optimism in Hungary. They were excited about the future in Hungary. And then that optimism, it was crushed. It was crushed in November of 1956 when the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, he sent in the tanks. Tanks rolled through Budapest. There was firefighting in the street. 2,500 Hungarians died during the Soviet crackdown in November of 1956. And at the exact same time that this was happening, the nations of the world, they were convening in Melbourne for the Olympic Games. Hungarian athletes were there, the Soviet Union and Soviet athletes were there. And as fate would have it, as all this was happening back in Budapest, the water polo teams for these two nations, Hungary and the Soviet Union, they met in the semifinals of the water polo contest at the Olympic Games. And here's what happened, and this is a remarkable moment. Things were tense, of course, but the Hungarian and the Soviet athletes, they came together and they shook hands, they embraced before the match. They played a spirited but very clean game. I don't remember who actually won the contest. Nobody does. That's not the point. The point was the sportsmanship being exhibited by the athletes. In response to this sportsmanship, Soviet and Hungarian leaders, they called a truce on the streets of Budapest. They went to the negotiating table, and the Soviet Union decided, because of the respect that they had for the Hungarian athletes, they decided to pull their troops out of Budapest. The Soviets left, the Hungarian Revolution continued, and freedom, political freedoms, came to Hungary. No, that's not what happened. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you, but that's just not how it works. Sports just don't actually have the power to do something like that. We're going to talk about this today. Here's what actually happened. First of all, the leader of the Hungarian Revolution, Imre Nagy, he was arrested and he was executed by the Soviet Union. So the head of the Hungarian Revolution, that head was cut off. Because the Soviet Union was there in Melbourne in 1956, other nations decided they could not take part in these Olympic Games. 3 nations, Spain, Holland, and Switzerland, they boycotted the 1956 Olympic Games because of the presence of the Soviet Union. These are the first Olympic boycotts. There will be more Olympic boycotts. I will briefly mention some of them later today. And then there was the water polo match. This did actually happen. The Soviet Union and Hungary, they met in the semifinals. The arena was filled with Australians who were waving the Hungarian flag, and they were jeering the Soviet players, booing the Soviets, whistling at them as they entered the pool for the contest. The Hungarians got out to a quick 2-0 lead. The Hungarian players and the fans, they were taunting the Soviets. They were calling them murderers. They were calling them invaders. And then all hell broke loose. In the final minute of the match, a Soviet player, tired of all of the name-calling, threw a vicious elbow at the Hungarian water polo player, Ervin Zador. It opened up his cheek. Blood flowed into the pool. The water turned red, according to some reporters. And there was a fight. There was a fist fight in the pool. Hungarians and Soviets, they were battling in the water. The Australian police had to come down and surround the whole pool and start dragging the players out. The match was suspended. Hungary was declared the winner. Fists flew and blood flowed was one of the headlines in the Australian newspapers the next day. This moment has forever been known as the bloody pool. If you say the bloody pool when you're talking about the Olympics, people know you're talking about 1956. And then how about this? Those Hungarian water polo players and other Hungarian athletes, they did not want to go back to Budapest. They did not want to go back to Hungary in what was now rigidly Soviet-controlled Hungary. So here's what happened. This is a fascinating story. Not too many people know this. sports writers working for Sports Illustrated, but having talked to the CIA, they made contact with the Hungarian athletes, and they asked them, would you like to defect to the United States? One by one, Hungarian athletes, they began leaving the Olympic Village into waiting cars where CIA agents were behind the wheel, and they were whisked away to safe houses where they were hidden all throughout Melbourne. 38 athletes in all walked out of the Olympic Village and went into the care of the CIA. They waited for the Hungarian and the Soviet teams to leave Melbourne. And then in December, they boarded a jet and they flew to San Francisco. They actually arrived on New Year's Eve, 1956. And this is where they began their new lives as Americans. And this is when the Soviet Union said that the United States was a nation of kidnappers. And they said that the United States was fanning the flames of the Cold War. They were making the Cold War worse, exacerbating tensions. Here is my point. Sports were not lessening international tensions, right? Sports were exacerbating those tensions. They were making these tensions worse. There was an awfully astute writer living in England, in London, in the middle of the 20th century, a guy named George Orwell. He wrote that book, Animal Farm, about cows and chickens and pigs, but I've always sensed that that was more than a children's book, that there was actually a little more going on. It's just a theory of mine. Back in 1945, George Orwell attended an international athletic competition, and he was horrified by what he saw. He was horrified by the nationalistic passions that was unleashed. He was horrified by the violence that he saw on the playing field. He returned to his flat in London. He sat down at his typewriter, and he wrote this: "Serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It is bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting."